see all of you here and to welcome you here. Bettina ji is now it's the fourth time with us. And I have personally taken 3 teachings from her, 3 texts. This is the 4th one that I'm doing with her. And all I can say from my personal experience, she's an extremely good teacher. And taking these teachings from her on Kashmir Shaivism, which I think is the closest view of Hindu philosophy that comes closest to the Buddhist view of Shunyata. And as you will see, not here I think, but as you will see a lot of Buddhist students as well. And that's something that we always welcome, because our Rinpoche's vision is to make this institution in the Nalanda tradition, which means that we want to teach all the wisdom traditions, of course, of India, and if possible, of the world. And also Bettina ji, maybe some of you know, was invited by Rinpoche to speak to the monks at the monastic college that Rinpoche runs. And I know that for the monks it was such an impressive and such an enriching experience that they requested Bettina ji to please come back for 2 weeks to teach her. But I think that she has not been able to find the time for it. And so that's all I want to say. And Praveen is here. He's the manager of the institute. He's an extremely accommodating, patient, and kind person. So we try to make it as comfortable for you. And we are basically very informal. And in case there is any shortcomings that we have, or anything that you feel that you require or need, please let the office know. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you, Bettina ji.
Thank you, Sureshji, and welcome to all of you. I suppose most of you are going to participate also in the retreat. And so this is actually the beginning. Now, traditionally, as it is in Buddhism and in any other Indian tradition, we start with an invocation in Sanskrit. And from tomorrow, those who participate will also learn some of these invocation shlokas. Yasyamantaha vishvametat vibhati bahyapasam prasamanam visrishto kshopekshine nutaraya stitauta vande devim smatma samviti ekam. From the beginning of my association with Deer Park, for which I consider myself fortunate, I was impressed by the idea of teaching here Indian wisdom traditions and not only Buddhism, so that the teachings here are open, as Sureshji just said, to other traditions, mainly Indian wisdom traditions. In fact, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama expresses on many occasions, the interrelatedness of Buddhism and other Indian philosophical and spiritual traditions has to be seen and acknowledged if we want to understand them. The time of controversy and opposition between schools, though it was fruitful in the development of their respective philosophies, should be over in our present age, and make place for an enriching dialogue, for which again His Holiness is setting an example. He also stresses again and again that each tradition has to be seen in its own right. And that is why even last year, it is not a question of comparing, but of studying a tradition and practicing a tradition in its own right. And even in the area of dialogue, His Holiness gives more importance to the spiritual dimension than to the doctrinal or philosophical one. Now, this is also the reason that the seminars and teachings held here have the form of retreats and not just study of texts and academic discussions. Each time, it is a matter of absorbing the teaching in one's own life and leading to an inner awakening, or ultimately enlightenment. This is precisely the goal of the Indian wisdom traditions, which, unlike our vast system of informative knowledge, aim at a transformative knowledge. If the information technology is moving ever faster, the transformative knowledge has, on the contrary, to slow us down. Therefore, it has to go along with meditation and contemplation, which lead us to stillness and emptiness and make us receptive. The beautiful Sanskrit word, patra. These are some general ideas which come to mind, which seem to be obvious for anyone interested in these wisdom traditions, but it may be useful to express them on this occasion. Now, the teaching of any one of these traditions and their texts, including the Buddhist schools, presupposes a certain background knowledge to place them in the context to which they belong. This is the idea behind such a lecture. At the beginning of a teaching of a particular text, and this was discussed with the director Prashant and Ajirji, that this should become a practice here, that at the beginning of any teaching of a particular tradition, such an introductory lecture will be helpful to clarify the background. In my earlier retreat seminars at Deer Park, this was given as an introduction to the seminar itself. But since the background knowledge of the participants is so varied, such a short introduction does not seem sufficient. And hence, some basic questions would arise in the course of the seminar. And not only for participants, but for others interested in the activities of Deer Park, such general lectures introducing a particular tradition and its texts may be useful and even serve as a kind of orientation in this vast jungle of Indian traditions. At first, the question may be asked, why do we engage ourselves with such difficult texts, mostly in Sanskrit and Tibetan and maybe Pali and other languages, if most of us are not scholars but are spiritual seekers? The answer will be given by the texts themselves, which contain such a treasure of experience and the ways and methods, upaya, leading to that experience, even though expressed in a difficult language. And it is by studying and meditating on them that they come alive, that the words start penetrating our mind and heart and leading us to that level beyond the word. In terms of Kashmir Shaivism, from Vaikari, the expressed word, to Madhyama, the thought, which is expressed, to Pashyanti, the intuitive, illuminating insight beyond language, and finally to Para, the level of silence and the source of all thought and language. Welcome. The present lecture should serve such a purpose, that is both to introduce the text which we are going to study in the coming week, and to give a general introduction to its context, what is commonly called Kashmir Shaivism. Of course, it is impossible to do justice to this in a single lecture, so I have to be selective. Kashmir was a center for different religious traditions, at least from the 5th century onwards, and which attained an unprecedented development between the 8th to the 13th centuries. Buddhism was strongly present and influential, and various schools of Tantra, both Vaishnava, Shiva, and different traditions centered on the feminine divine or Shakti, and also the sun cult or Saura tradition, as testified by the magnificent Martant Sun Temple in Kashmir. These traditions were interacting and influencing each other, even through controversy at the philosophical level and debate, but at a spiritual and religious or practical level, there was a strong common ground uniting these traditions across sectarian barriers. Now, Kashmir was also a great center of Sanskrit learning, poetry, poetics, dramaturgy, culminating in the 9th and 10th centuries with the great Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta. If we generally talk of Kashmiri Shaivism, we have to be conscious, first of all, that there were two distinct traditions, Shaiva traditions in Kashmir. The first being more correctly called Shiva Siddhanta, which is now more prevalent in South India. If you go to any of these great temples in South India, they follow the Shiva Siddhanta in their ritual, iconography, architecture, and so on and so on. Now, the Shiva Siddhanta has a dualistic doctrine. Dualistic means that the soul and the divine can never unite. They will always remain separate, even at the level of liberation. So this dualism is throughout. So they have a strong bhakti element, but also a strong element of ritualism. And the second Shaiva tradition being the non-dualistic Shaivism, which has created a synthesis of various tantric schools, as we shall see, sometimes called Trika Shaivism because in the later phase, the Trika school became predominant. The second reason why Kashmir Shaivism or Kashmiri Shaivism is a misnomer concerns the geographical localization. Although it is true that many of the texts and traditions have their origin in Kashmir, as also most of the important authors, the tradition has not remained limited to that region, but has spread to South India and also to the west, Maharashtra, and to the east, Orissa, and so on, as can be seen by the influence of religious and spiritual practices and what is very specific, certain specific mantras have, which are very specific to Kashmiri Shaivism. You can suddenly find them in some ritual or in some text in a remote other part of India. So this tradition has been extremely influential, especially in the context of Tantra. Now, another reason of the influence of Kashmiri Shaivism on other Indian traditions is that the philosophy of recognition, pratyabhijna, which is the basic philosophy of Kashmiri Shaivism, has become a standard philosophy for all the tantric schools, independently whether they are Vaishnava or Shakta or Shaiva, so that sectarianism, we always think of sectarian terms, but this has been widespread and permeated all the other schools. Now, one of the proofs for this is that a very important text for Indian philosophy, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha of Madhava, a South Indian of the 14th century, gives a detailed account of the philosophical school of Pratibhijna, or recognition. So this philosophy, as I've said, has become extremely influential. In the words of Professor Torella, who is the great specialist of this school, quote, Pratibhijna, which provides the theoretical basis for all Hindu Tantrism, constitutes one of the highest and most original moments of all Indian thought. It has, moreover, very little to do with Vedanta. That's a bracket. Because many people think because it's non-dualism, it has to do with Vedanta. It's very different. Pratibhijna was born in Kashmir, the privileged land of Indian culture, in about the 9th, 10th century, when Tantric Shaivite sects, supporters of absolute non-dualism, decided to abandon their condition as more or less secret movements feared for their transgressive practices and confront the religious philosophical culture of the time on an equal footing, aspiring to become the dominant ideology in a far wider social circle than as conventicles of ascetic nocturnal devotees of the cremation grounds. Now, what this refers to, that these Shaivites, which are called of the left, they were originally the Pashupatas and Kapalikas and so on, who were ascetics following some extreme rituals and extreme sadhana connected with the cremation ground and so on. So this was obviously limited to these extreme groups, and they are therefore also called Atimarga, those who are transgressive also in their practices. And so this could not become a religion or a spirituality for the general people. And what in this non-dualistic development has happened, that they moved away from these extreme practices and they opened it not just to ascetics, but to the householder, grihastha. So everybody could practice and experience that spirituality. And that has made it so accessible to not only to the Kashmiris, but to anybody, and even outside their tradition. Both the major schools of so-called Kashmiri Shaivism, Shiva Siddhanta and the Trika, are based on a vast corpus of revealed scriptures called Agamas or Tantra. These are authoritative for all Shaivas, although their doctrines differ. According to a mythological tradition of the descent of these Agamas from Shiva, it was the sage Durvasas who assigned the promulgation of their revelations to his 3 spiritual sons, Amardaka, Srinatha, and Triambaka, who represent the 3 doctrines of dualism, Peda, dualism cum non-dualism, Peda Abheda, and non-dualism, Abheda. Accordingly, there are 3 classes of Agamas with long lists of names, of which only a limited number has come down to us. The non-dualist Agamas are attributed to the aspect of Shiva as Bhairava, usually the fierce aspect of the benign Shiva, and hence called Bhairava Agamas. Some of these Agamas have deeply influenced the religious life of the Shaivites, approximately from the 8th century to this day, to mention only the most important ones: Swachanda Tantra, Netra Tantra, Malini Vijayotara, Vigyana Bhairava, which we have been studying here, Paradrishika, and the unpublished Brahmayamala, Trishuru Bhairava, Tantra Sadbhava, and other tantras, of which manuscripts have been found in Nepal, but they are not yet published and much less translated. Well, even the others most of them are not translated. So there is a vast scope for scholars to discover and to study these tantras, which are very rich in terms of practice and yoga. What do these revealed texts contain? A complete agama, whether dualistic or non-dualistic, contains 4 main sections or pada: ritual, kriya, way of life and conduct of an initiate, charya, philosophy, vidya, and yoga. The dualistic agamas are heavily burdened with ritual, the most important of which being initiation, diksha, the very condition for liberation. Ritual, kriya, is not absent from the non-dualist Bhairava agamas, but they demonstrate an astonishing freedom in relation to ritual obligation. They relativize also the restrictions of caste and gender, since the main purpose is the spiritual path to liberation. To quote an example of a tantra most favored by the great Abhinavagupta in his Light on the Tantras, Tantra Loka, the Malini Vijayottara, quote, "In the practice of this tantra, there is neither purity nor its absence, no concern of what may be eaten and so forth, neither dualistic observance nor its rejection, neither such ritual as linga worship nor their abandonment, neither the rule of owning nothing nor its opposite. Everything may be enjoined or forbidden in this scripture. This is strictly ruled in it, O Empress of the gods." He's always addressing the Devi because it's a dialogue between Shiva and the goddess. "That the meditator, striving with all his strength, should fix his awareness firmness on reality. He may adopt whatever form of practice enables him to achieve that." So see what a tremendous freedom these tantras are teaching. One should not forget, in contrast, that the life of a Shaiva initiate is strictly governed by rules of ritual and conduct. Since initiation is central, indispensable for the dualists, the non-dualists had to find a way out to do justice to this essential requirement, and at the same time preserve the freedom of going beyond ritual. If in Shaiva Siddhanta it is ritual action kriya that leads to liberation, in the non-dualist trika and prativijna, it is inspirational, non-discursive knowledge. Therefore, in the latter, even ritual must be a kind of knowing. And I quote from Professor Sanderson, "The whole text of the ritual was thereby transformed into a series of variations on the theme of non-duality and the non-dualization of awareness." This is very important. Non-dualization of awareness. Because a ritual always presupposes a duality. There is the practitioner, there is the act, there is the deity to whom it is offered, and so on. But the whole ritual becomes transformed into a non-dual act of awareness. So ritual remains the paradigm because, the religious life in India was so much dominated by ritual that you have to do something with it. You have to transform it into something of a higher level. To give just 2 examples from the Vikana Bhairava Tantra. Puja. Well, puja is the most dualistic aspect of ritual. So there's the worshipper, there's object of worship, there are instruments of worship, and so on and so on. But what is puja? Worship does not consist in offering flowers and other substances. The real worship consists rather in setting one's mind firmly on the supreme void of thought-free consciousness. This worship is an absorption with great fervor and respect. So what is the real puja? And the great firmament of the voidness of consciousness. Then, what is real oblation? The offering into the fire sacrifice, homa. Real oblation consists in offering all the elements, the senses and sense objects, along with the mind, into the fire of the great abode of the void, using awareness as the sacrificial ladle. The spoon, the wooden spoon with which you offer the ghee into the fire. So what is that wooden spoon? That is your awareness. And that altar into which all these elements are offered is the great abode of the void. These are just two examples to show you this transformation of this non-dualization of ritual activity. And yet one should not understand that knowledge excludes action, as in Vedanta. And this is the Kashmiri Shaivites are also very critical of Vedanta. See, in Vedanta, the Brahman, the Absolute itself, is inactive, totally inactive, whereas the Absolute in Kashmiri Shaivism is active through his energy, Shakti. So there is extreme, there's this spanda, there's this vibration, there's this activity. So they always criticize that inactivity of the Vedantic Absolute and of the practitioners. Rather, and this is a quote again from Professor Sanderson, the expanded consciousness, which is the absolute of the Shaiva left, did not exclude the plurality of action, for it was defined as that which projects itself as this plural and sequential reality and timeless simultaneity of the consciousness which is its inner ground. Now, this sentence, which is a little tight, it will help us tomorrow with the very first sutra. I think I read it again, it's very concentrated. Now, action which is normally understood to be on basis of duality, there is an actor and there's an object and there's an activity and so on. But it was defined, the plurality of action was defined as that which projects itself as this plural and sequential reality and timeless simultaneity at the same time of the consciousness which is its inner ground. So this is what is going to engage us tomorrow with the first sutra. Coming back to the nature of the agama, Abhinavagupta says at the end of his commentary on the Paratrishika, and this I must say it in Sanskrit, Etat agama sarvasva prana daya eva yukti yuktya hridayam gami kritam. I have absorbed into my heart this treasure of agama with the help of appropriate methods of reflection and yoga, because it is life itself. Pranataya eva, because it is life itself. So this agama, or tantra, but it has to be absorbed in the heart with the help of reflection and yoga. The goal of non-dual practice, whether ritual or spiritual, is an integration of all aspects of life and of the universe into the unity consciousness arising from a harmonious union with the Supreme, Shiva or Bhairava. So Abhinavagupta reinterprets the offerings made in Puja, again similar as to the Vikana Bhairava. This is from the Tantra Loka. As for the presentation of offerings to the deities in its true form, this is the reunion of the alienated totality of phenomena with the autonomous, pure, and infinite self, which is the consciousness of Bhairava. Beautiful. What is that offering to the deities? It is the reunion with that ultimate consciousness. One of the important subjects of any Tantra or Agama is mantra, and each Agama reveals a mantra specific to that tradition and to the aspect of the deity. It is the non-dualist that has most extensively developed a whole theory of mantra. Hence, as a whole, it is called mantra marga, very parallel to the mantrayana in Mahayana Buddhism. Mantrayana, mantra marga, yana and marga mean the same. It's a part of mantra. The Kashmiri exegetes of these tantras have contributed most to this theory of mantra shastra on the basis of a whole philosophy and theology of the word, vak, of language in general. And this is also something which we will encounter in the text in the Shiva Sutras. This will be one of the topics engaging us these coming days. Coming back to the historical scenario in Kashmir in the centuries leading up to the 8th, 9th century, the three great traditions dominating were certainly Buddhism, different schools, Shiva Sutras, so-called right, and Trika, including the other tantric traditions, integrated in the non-dualist school, the so-called left. The Vaishnava Pancharatra, that was an ancient tantric school of the Vaishnavas, must have moved south and was no more an important presence. The important Shakta schools, Kula, Kaula, Krama, etc., continued to have a decisive influence, and they were integrated into the Shaiva left. Apart from the Tantras and their lineages of masters and disciples, there were Siddhas and Yoginis, perfect spiritual beings belonging to either the Buddhist or Shaiva Shakta traditions, but with their own degree of freedom of realization. It is interesting to note that the historian Kalana, in his Rajatarangini, speaks of the reign of King Avantivarman, that is circa 855 to 9th century, as one, quote, one that was marked by the descent of siddhas among men for the benefit of the world. It's a very beautiful statement. So whether Buddhist or Shaiva, that is not said, but the descent of siddhas for the benefit of the world. And as he calls it, Siddha Avataran. We speak of Avatara, but so the descent of siddhas and yoginis, of course, for the benefit of men. It is in this context that Vasugupta has to be placed, not the author, but the revealer or discoverer of the Shiva Sutras. He is described as a siddha by the commentators of the Shiva Sutras, but the information about his life is very scarce. He lived as an ascetic on the Mahadeva mountain, which is still sacred and a place of pilgrimage for Hindus in Kashmir. Vasugupta, his name is significant, it means the hidden treasure, is described as being filled with extreme devotion to Maheshvara, who received his awakening due to a powerful descent of grace, Shaktipata, and whose heart had been purified by the true tradition transmitted to him by various yoginis and siddhas. This is a paraphrase of what Kshemaraja says about Vasugupta in his introduction to his commentary. He was devoted to Parameshvara. This description has rightly been interpreted in the sense as to explain the somehow eclectic teachings. He has been inspired by yoginis and siddhas, so various yoginis. It's not said any particular one. So that the teaching of the Shiva Sutras is a bit eclectic. It combines several elements. Now, Vasugupta was driven by a desire to establish a continuity of the esoteric tradition, in Sanskrit, Rahasya Sampradaya Ma Vichedi. He is instructed by Shiva, don't interrupt that tradition, that Rahasya Sampradaya means that esoteric tradition. And to oppose the dominant dualistic doctrine. So the main opponent of this Shiva Sutra and its commentaries, etc., are not the Buddhists, but the dualists. So the same Shaivas, the Shaivas who believed in the same scriptures, in the same ritual, the same Diksha, and so on. But they were the main opponents because of their dualism. So the main purpose of this revelation was to, as they presented, to come back to the non-dualism, which is already there in the Agamas, but which was not alive, and it was to be brought back to life by this revelation of the Shiva Sutras. Now there is another opponent is mentioned who was a Buddhist siddha, Nagabodhi. But he is only mentioned. There's not much is said about. Can you close the doors? But Nagabodhi is mentioned in the beginning of this introduction to the Shiva Sutras, but he is acknowledged as a Siddha. So it is not that they say, well, he has not attained any. No, his spiritualization is fully acknowledged. The doctrine may be different. So they have a difference in the philosophical level. But he is recognized. He was a great Siddha, as was Vasugupta. So this is why this age must have been a tremendous spiritual life of the Siddhas and Yoginis, and definitely the Yoginis are mentioned. So there were female lineages of Yoginis passing on that esoteric tradition or Rahasya Sampradaya. Now, the strong dedication of Vasugupta to establish a non-dual mystical tradition led to his receiving Shiva's grace in a dream. Shiva, can you close it also because it is cold? Shiva directed him to find a great rock where the secret would be revealed. Waking up the next morning, he went in search of that rock. Here you have these photos are not very visible, but you can see it afterwards. This is the rock, at least traditionally believed to be that rock. Vasugupta went in search of that rock, and on finding it, touched it with his hand, and the rock turned upside down and revealed the sutras inscribed on that. So he, as we say even in English, by heart, he absorbed the sutras in his memory and his heart, and then the rock turned again upside down and the sutras were hidden from view. Now, this story is very significant. Now, what you have here, I think you have surely visited the place, and of course I am going there every year, what the Kashmiris call Shankapal. And it is revered not only by Hindus, but even by Muslims. I went last year into the Dachikam, and there was a Muslim guard, because this is a wildlife sanctuary. It's inside the wildlife sanctuary. And then he said, you must go, this is a very sacred place. And so, and he had, with great devotion, he said, you must touch this rock and so on, and sit there and meditate. Muslim. So they also feel that there is something very special. There's a little problem about the location, whether it's really, because it says Mahadeva Girau. Well, Vasugupta lived on the Mahadeva mountain, but the rock is in the valley. So whether it's really this rock, but still the tradition is quite old. So obviously there is no inscription visible now because it has been hidden from view after Vasugupta had seen those sutras and internalized them. Now one could give a mystical meaning to the whole legend, which is very much in tune with the Kashmiri Shiva philosophy or tradition. The rock stone is the most solid matter, which is always given as an example of a solidity of matter, jara, the inert matter. And on that inert matter, the most spiritual sutras have been revealed. And this is, can you take him out? This is very much in tune with the philosophy, the entire philosophy of Kashmiri Shaivism, that there is nothing which is simply matter. Even the most material, even the most solid, inert, it is full of that consciousness about which we are going to speak tomorrow. It is vibrating with consciousness, and that is why that spanda is such an important concept. So that very rock revealed that spanda, revealed that spiritual essence. So it is not, it's not just a legend, it's a whole philosophy behind, a whole spirituality behind. There's nothing material, that everything is spiritual. But the condition for discovering it is you have to be a siddha. You have to attain that state of consciousness where it can be revealed, where you can receive it. So this is why this legend is not just a legend, it has many implications. Now, the instruction of Shiva also contained the words to reveal the secret to those who are worthy of grace. Anugraha yogyeshu prakashaya. The first who was worthy of this grace was his Vasugupta's close disciple, Pattakalata. What this legend implies is that the Shiva Sutras are in an intermediary position between direct revelation as the Agamas and human authorship, because many sutras are composed by a human author. The Brahma Sutras are by Badarayana, Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, and so on. But here you have an intermediary between Shiva and Vasugupta. So Vasugupta is only the recipient and not the author. And this demonstrates one of the ways revelation can take place, where the rishi or siddha becomes an instrument of the divine message. It is clear that the discovery of the Shiva Sutras marks the historical beginning of non-dualist Shaivism, circa at the end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century. Vasugupta being the human founder after a series of semi-human carriers of the tradition. Let us stop for a moment at the form of the sutras. Of course, everybody is familiar with sutras of different traditions. Every Indian philosophical spiritual tradition or darshana starts with the first establishment of the teaching in sutra form. Sutra, of course, means a thread, and all the whole symbolism of these texts, whether it is sutra or tantra, is all connected with weaving. Thread and the texture, well, even the English word texture, it is also, it's a cloth, it's a thread, and so tantra also means which is the weaving, what is woven together into a whole, and sutra is the thread on which the pearls or the beads of a mala are strung together. Now these beads are these extremely brief aphorisms which consist mostly only of 2 words. So there is a saying, many of the Sanskrit texts are extremely extensive, but there is a saying by the grammarians in Sanskrit that even if you cut half a syllable of a sutra, then they will rejoice more than in the birth of a son. Ardhamatra laghavena, how is it? Putrotsava iva manyante vayakarana. Of course, Vasugupta was not the author so he is not the author of the sutra, but the brevity of the sutra has several implications. One is that it contains the essence, sara. Another one is that it can have multiple meanings. And so it is language in a very condensed form. And so condensed that it is open to several interpretations. So it is not that linearity of a sentence and of a whole development so on, but it has some of the quality of a mantra. But of course, mantra is still more condensed. But a sutra is also that condensation of a thought, an idea into extremely brief expression consisting just of 2 words. And then, as in the Sanskrit style, of course, there's no verb. It's just 2 nouns. Then you have to connect it, you have to understand, and you have to... So, and this sutra form has several implications. One, practically, it's easier to memorize them, because traditionally the students, they had to memorize, and so the sutras, they could be memorized, and then the explanation will be given by the teacher. But once they have memorized the sutras, that is the basis of the teaching. And the other implication of the brevity is that their message is not so much a rational one, but a spiritual one. So that you just catch that essence. You have to, which is not easy. Either you get it or you don't get it, or you need a commentary, you need an explanation, you need a guru. Of course, the teaching of the sutras was always given by a guru, so then you have all the commentaries and so on. But the 3 steps of studying a sutra traditionally are: first you have to study the sutra alone, whether you understand it or not. Then you read the commentary, and then you come back to the sutra with the understanding of the commentary. So this is a traditional way. Now, as I said, as compared to the different schools of Indian philosophy, of the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali for the Yoga school, you have the Brahma Sutras by Badarayana as the beginning of the Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. So the Shiva Sutras are the beginning of the non-dual school of Kashmir Shaivism. Now the Abhinavagupta says that about this multiple meanings, manifold meanings of a sutra, he says in context of his Paratrishika Vivarana, all these explanations should be considered to be appropriate. This verse is a sutra. Therefore, by turning its words this way or that way, many kinds of explanations would become quite fit. As has been said, a sutra is that which gives scope to manifold senses. Now, a spiritual implication of the brevity of the sutra is that they can lead you into meditation. So if you get access through the sutra into a state of consciousness, and so they reveal their meaning at another level of consciousness than the rational or discursive one. See, discursive language, it needs a verb, it needs a whole set of long sentence and so on. But in that brevity, you can catch that moment of consciousness which is revealed in that expression. Or they are kind of hints to a deeper meaning, deeper level of reality. So one has to keep all these implications in mind when approaching the Shiva Sutras. By extension, there is another category of texts which is also called sutra because of the density of meaning, that is karika. More explicit and intelligible. Thankfully, a karika consists of a 2-line verse which has a verb and which has a proper sentence, and so it is much easier to understand than a sutra. According to Kshemaraja, the commentator of the 11th century, Vasugupta himself considered the Shiva Sutras too brief for understanding and composed an extended version in the Spandakarika. According to Bhaskara, the other commentator who lived half a century before Kshemaraja, the Spandakarikas were composed by Vasugupta's disciple Pattakalata. But it's not surprising, in the close Guru-Shishya relationship, whether it's the Guru who dictated or the disciple who was inspired by the Guru, doesn't make much difference. It is the lineage, it's in the same tradition, whether it was Pattakalata or Vasugupta himself. Thus, both Sutra and Karika are considered to be the basic texts of the Spanda school of Kashmir Shaivism, the school teaching the dynamism of consciousness and of the universe. It is, however, surprising that the term Spanda does not occur in the Shiva Sutras. Maybe it has been found necessary by Vasugupta to make it more explicit in the Spandakarika. Both foundational texts are not concerned about philosophy, but entirely related to spiritual practice and to mystical experience. Though Vasugupta's intention was to establish the non-dualism over against the common Shaiva dualism, he does not do this with philosophical arguments or doctrines. Instead of stating the non-dual unity, he describes a path leading to the supreme level of consciousness. It would therefore be wrong to read the Shiva Sutras as a philosophical text. For this reason, a spiritual approach related to practice and interiorization can alone do justice to these sutras. Two major commentaries have come down to us. The Shiva Sutra Vartika by Bhatta Bhaskara, who links himself directly to the spiritual lineage of Vasugupta and Kalata. So he's dated around 925 to 975. And the Shiva Sutra Vimarshini by Kshemaraja, illustrious disciple of the great Abhinavagupta in the 11th century. We leave aside the two shorter commentaries, the Shiva Sutra Vritti and the Shiva Sutra Vartika by Varadaraja, which are not so important. According to Professor Sanderson, a great scholar in this field, quote, "The study of the Shiva Sutra in its own right is problematic. Many of its 77 terse aphorisms are obscure in meaning, both individually and in sequence, which has allowed considerable divergences between the interpretations of Bhatta Bhaskara and Kshemaraja. Moreover, they reveal no close attachment to the terminology and concepts of the Krama, the Trika, or any single scripture-based system, so that we could clarify their meaning by drawing on its literature. One may say only that they present a creative epitome of doctrine and trans-ritual practice, drawing, probably eclectically, from Kaula traditions that venerate Bhairava and the mothers. So Kaula is the more Shakti-oriented tradition. Teaching that the goal of practice is to realize that one is oneself, the Shakti Chakreshvara, the deity that controls the diverse powers that constitute the universe of experience. Establishing this realization first through withdrawal into the heart of consciousness, and then through its expansion into the states that constitute the mundane awareness of the bound. This model of transcendence, followed by an expansion that causes the state of enlightenment to pervade the transcended, is central to the Kalikula, that is the Krama system, and the aphorisms may well have drawn it directly or indirectly from that source. But there is much in them that cannot obviously be derived from it, and several elements that cannot be traced to any other known scriptural source. This shows that the Shiva Sutras are quite original. So they are not just a digest of the Tantras or of what has come, but they are quite original. Of course, they have to use a certain terminology, because without language, but that terminology is also to be seen in their own light, and not in the light of any other system of philosophy. Kshemaraja, the genial commentator, was in the lineage of Trika and Prativijna of his great master Abhinavagupta. The philosophical tradition of recognition starts with Somananda in the 9th century or early 10th century. He is the author of the Shiva Drishti, or vision of Shiva. Then the great philosopher and mystic Utpaladeva, early 10th century, who really brought the philosophy to its clearest expression in his Ishvara Prativijna Karika. His disciple Lakshmanagupta did not leave any work behind, but he was the master of Abhinavagupta in Prativijna. Uttering the name of Abhinavagupta, 10th, 11th century, I have to restrain myself from describing his greatness in all fields. He was not only the greatest genius of Kashmir Shaivism, but I would say of Indian tradition as a whole, because he was not only a master in different schools of Tantra and their exegesis, philosophy, aesthetics and poetics, musicology and dramaturgy. He was a universal genius whose influence cannot be fathomed yet, and whose actuality has still to be discovered in all these fields. Kshemaraja was his most gifted disciple, who somehow completed the work of his master by writing extensive commentaries on the important tantras, Swachanda, Netra, on mystical stotras, Shiva Sutravali, Samba Panchashika, Stavat Chintamani, and independent works such as The Heart of Recognition, Prativijna Hridayam, besides, of course, his commentaries on the Shiva Sutras and Spandakarikas. So he was a very hard-working commentator and author. Tremendous. His interpretation of the Shiva Sutras is strongly influenced by the classification of the ways of liberation or realization by his guru Abhinavagupta. Thus, yes, well, we will, of course, when we come to the text, I will go more into detail. The Malini Vijayotara Tantra has 3 verses only describing 3 ways to liberation or to absorption into the divine consciousness. And it starts from below, from the individual way, Anava, then the way of energy, Shakta, then the divine way, Shambhava. Now, Abhinavagupta in his Tantra Loka, Light on the Tantras, he has reversed the order, and it starts from above. Not only from the divine way, but from the highest, supreme, which is the non-way, Anupaya. There's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, everything is already given, everything is already realized. This is Anupaya. So he starts from Anupaya and then comes to the divine way, then the way of energy, then the individual way. Now why it goes in the opposite direction, we will come to that when we come to the text. Because it's not a matter of, pedagogy. Now first you have to start from very below because you are very low and you are very much bound, and then slowly you have to rise up and you have to do so much of asana and pranayama and this and that. No, you start from the highest because you are that already. And then if you are not able to catch it, you can come down a little bit. You can have some practices of which you are capable. And if you are not capable of that, you can still come down a little bit. But first you have to start from the highest. And this is the uniqueness of, I would say, Abhinavagupta, and then, of course, Kshemaraja. So what he does in interpreting the Shiva Sutras is he sees them in the light of these 3 ways to liberation, upaya. 3, because anupaya is anyhow beyond there's nothing, it does not apply. But the 3 ways which are already given in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. Now, whether this was the original meaning of the Shiva Sutras, we cannot say, because in certain sutras, they seem to indicate that his interpretation is correct, but that kind of systematization may not be the original intention of the Shiva Sutras. But in any case, we will follow in this coming days, we will follow Kshemaraja, because this is really the best commentary. And I would say, as when you go to a supermarket and you say, buy 1 and get 3. You buy 1 that is Kshemaraja, and you get Vikana Bhairava, you get Spandakarika, you get all these other tantras, which he goes on quoting, and which give you a lot of indication for practice. So it's not just interpretation, but by quoting Vikana Bhairava, he gives you the hint what this sutra means in practice. And that is why even those who have not studied the Vikana Bhairava, they will have a chance to at least some selected but very important practices or dharanas from Vikana Bhairava. So to this, we will come to these 3 ways to liberation, upaya, when we come to the text. So Kshemaraja supports his interpretation, as I said, by quoting these important tantras, including the Swachanda and Netra and Malini Vijayotara. So these quotations are very, very important, and they give really some examples also for the kind of yoga which is taught in those tantras, especially these 3 tantras and Vikana Bhairava, of course. And of course, both Bhaskara and Kshemaraja constantly refer to the Spandakarika, which is really the expanded expression of the sutras. So all these texts together, these tantras, quoted, and the Spandakarika, they will help us to understand the sutras, which in themselves are really very enigmatic, or often very enigmatic. Before coming to the end of this somehow sketchy introduction, let me mention some of the central themes of both the sutras and the Vimarshini. They justify the 2 authentic names of what we call imprecisely Kashmiri Shaivism. The authentic name is Svatantriyavada. It's the doctrine of absolute freedom, absolute autonomy. And Samvit Advayavada, the doctrine of the non-dualism of consciousness. So, and these are, you see that the name Shiva doesn't occur there. It is the content which is important, the content which is Svatantriya, attainment of this absolute freedom, and that non-dualism of consciousness. So these are the real names given by the system itself, not Kashmir Shaivism, something given from outside, It was an invention of Mr. Chatterjee in the 1920s. And these 2 names of the so-called Kashmiri Shaivism, they will be very clearly proved by the Shiva Sutras and the commentary. The importance given to Svatantriya, importance given to the non-duality, non-dualism of consciousness. Therefore, the purpose of the text, as mentioned in the title of this lecture, is precisely to lead to the awakening of such a state of non-duality with the Supreme Consciousness, powerfully expressed in the very first sutra. What this implies for the practitioner, sadhaka or yogi, is therefore an analysis and self-introspection of the stages of consciousness. From the individual consciousness, with its limitations and lack of freedom, to the universal, all-pervading, and therefore divine consciousness. Since it is all centered around this process, the most important practice consists in interiorization, antarmukhata, on the one hand, and maintaining awareness, and there are many words for that, avatana, anusandhana, bhavana, and other aspects of meditation on the other. The methods are therefore very subtle, since they do not include any yoga practices like asana, pranayama, etc., which they rather reinterpret in their own light. The analysis of states of consciousness comprises, of course, the well-known states of waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the fourth. So there's the great emphasis of the fourth state. Fourth state means that which transcends the three ordinary states of the human experience, waking, dream, and deep sleep. That's why it's only called the fourth. But it is experienced in samadhi, in deep meditation. Now, and this turiya, this fourth, which has ultimately to permeate all other states and activities. And there are a few sutras related to this, the permeation of all states. Now we are in the waking state, and then we are going to sleep, and the sleep, dreaming, and so on. But this fourth state has to pervade all the other three states. That's one of the important, some of the important sutras point to that. So that nothing remains outside that transcendental consciousness. The path is therefore one that leads from introspection to integration. Thank you.